Well, a very warm welcome to this opening event of International Treasury Week, a packed programme of events bringing together not just the Association of Corporate Treasurers, but also many major Treasury associations throughout the world. And day one, of course, is all about managing unprecedented risks. And our opening session today will be on the changing economic and fiscal landscape in 2020, a global macroeconomic overview. Well, my name's Shone, and I'm a business journalist and CEO of the research group Explain the Market, and I'll be your host for the next hour. And before I introduce our distinguished panel, I'd just like to encourage everyone to get involved in the discussion, either by submitting a question or a point of view just via the Q&A button you should see floating above all of our heads, or via the ACT's LinkedIn groups, or even by following at ACT Update Twitter profile, or using the hashtag on Twitter, hashtag ACTITW. I'll be making sure that there's plenty of time at the end of today's conversation to put as many of your contributions to our panel as possible. So let's introduce that distinguished group now. We've got Louis Kuijs is head of Asia Economics at Oxford Economics. Dr. Monica Malik is the chief economist at Abu Dhabi Commercial Bank. Rain Newton-Smith is the chief economist at the CBI, the Confederation of British Industries, and Klaus Vistesen is the chief Eurozone economist for Pantheon Macro. So without further ado, first question to Rain. The COVID-19 crisis has brought about the most radical and rapid corporate restructuring that some industries have experienced for decades. What does your research and your conversation with leaders suggest are now the most important priorities for business?
Well, I think certainly today's conversation after the statement by the Prime Minister yesterday is about how we can start to reopen more of our businesses safely. I think that's where businesses' mindsets have been are really this week. And I think if you sort of step back a bit and think about, where has been the overall broad macroeconomic response, I think what we do know is around 4 out of 10 businesses have had to close their operations in the UK completely for at least a period of time over the past few weeks. And that's been necessary to protect the health of the nation. We've all had, and some of that has happened because, retails and other high street shops that aren't providing essential services have had to close their doors. But what's happened is also, our manufacturers have had to close their doors, and some of that's been issues around supply, but a lot of that has also been needing to look at how they operate and making sure that they can keep their staff safe. And of course, there's been a huge impact on demand as we've all been staying home, and we've been, and as this has played out into more of an economic shock. And I think the policy response so far has really focused on 2 main areas. One was, how can we protect as many jobs and livelihoods as this crisis evolves? And that's where the job retention scheme, was designed by the government to really provide a support to employees. So instead of making an employee redundant, you can put them on furlough so that they will stay at home for a period of time. The government will pay 80% of their salary, up to a cap of 2,500 approximately in total, including the national insurance contributions. And we know that that's protected around 6 million jobs already. And then the second big element has been about using our financial system. So we've seen the Bank of England and the Treasury working in tandem to ensure that we have mechanisms in which businesses can manage the huge pressure we've seen on their cash flow. So many businesses obviously have seen revenue completely dry up. They are viable businesses. We need to create a bridge to the other side of this crisis. And so at the very small end, there's been the bounce back loans where very small businesses can get loans, interest-free loans almost automatically. And then there's been the business interruption loan scheme for medium and larger businesses. And of course, at the very large end, the Bank of England have been operating a commercial paper scheme, mainly for investment grade or equivalent businesses. So I think that's been the two crucial pillars of the economic support so far. I think now we're almost in the fortunate position, though of course things can change, that we're now starting to think, okay, how can we all start to return to work safely? How can we know we're not going to return to life as normal, but how can we gradually open up more and more of the economy? And I think people are thinking, one, what sort of support do we need for the transport system? Because obviously a key part is how can employees get to work safely? And the Prime Minister last night said, you know, people should only use public transport to get to work if there are no alternatives. It's really about encouraging people to get to work by other means, but of course to work from home where that is possible. And I think what employers are really doing at the moment, we've seen some interesting examples already, is how can they open up their production safely? So a car producer has looked at their production lines and ensured that employees are not any closer than 2 meters apart on that production line. We've seen construction sites look at their sites. Obviously, a lot of construction happens out of doors, so that makes some of it a bit easier, but obviously, again, making sure that employees aren't getting too close, or where they are, where they do for a specific task need to be closer than 2 meters, that they have the right equipment to be able to do that safely. And I think one of the important things that's on many businesses' minds is they don't want to be competing with the NHS for scarce resources in terms of PPE equipment. So often a solution to that is providing the equipment that's one grade below what you need for NHS when you're in the workplace, because obviously you're not, as a matter of course, treating patients in the same way that the NHS needs to. So I think it's really important that we don't compete with those scarce resources. And of course, a big element as well is when our schools open, because accept more students. They are open for students of key workers, because that just makes it much easier for working parents to be able to go back to work full time. So I think those are some of the issues that are really on businesses' minds this week.
And Ray, is it possible to sum up the reaction from business to what the government has put in place so far?
Well, look, we know that businesses have talked about the job retention scheme as being an absolute lifeline. It's been hugely important. We know it's helped to protect many jobs. It's helped to keep the overall level of unemployment lower in this critical time. So that's been hugely, hugely valuable. I think businesses recognize as we move forward over the coming months, at some point we need to look at how we taper that overall scheme. It's not something you would expect to be up and running for over a year, for example. So now we need to think about how, as the economy starts to open up, how do we taper through that scheme while helping to support households. I think and more broadly on the loan schemes, I think where that has worked well, it's been a huge lifeline for many businesses. I think some of the challenges, some businesses will say, look, it's still such an uncertain world. I already had a high level of debt before I went into this crisis. Do I really want to take on more debt as I head into this crisis? And I don't know how quickly my business is going to open up. That has been a real concern for businesses. And I think in some areas, that's where obviously for small businesses in retail, there is a system of grants, but some businesses are, would like more direct support, I think, to sort of bridge to the other side.
And we know as well that there are similar schemes. There are similarities between these interventions across Europe too. And can I just sort of turn to Asia now and just speak to Louis? And I just want to, Louis, China and several other Asian countries were obviously hit by the coronavirus in some senses, a lot more severely than the rest of the world. And they've now been moving towards lifting restrictions and trying to get back to normality for quite some time. Are there other lessons, Louis, that we can learn from China and other Asian economies for Europe, the UK, and the US?
Yes, Guy, I think there are lessons, but if I'm honest, I think those lessons are actually going to be quite hard to swallow for the Western world. If you look at the broad spectrum of experiences in Asia, because it is a pretty heterogeneous continent in many ways, it's also quite heterogeneous in terms of what has happened, in terms of the dynamics between the outbreak, government responses, and then how the economy responds to that. I would say on the plus side, there now have been some really nice examples, not just China, but also in Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, but also Vietnam, also Australia and Thailand, where the whole dynamics have become positive in the sense that you see a quite decisive containment of the COVID-19 outbreak that is then allowing those governments to start to remove those restrictions. And to be honest, in the case of some of the economies like South Korea, Taiwan, these restrictions were never that fierce to start with because they had different strategies to contain the outbreak. Their strategies relied on things like extremely vigorous testing and tracing. Like once you find a case, locate all the people that they've been in contact with, make sure that you quarantine those people. So these governments, I think, in large part, because of their experience with SARS, have been primed or prepared for this outbreak and have been quite successful in that containment. That allows them to then ease restrictions, and that then means that people become more confident. So if you look at the same kind of data, like the Google mobility data across the world, then you see that in those Asian economies where the dynamics are positive, we see good things happening. But I have to emphasize, there are also several Asian economies still, including Northeast Asian ones that faced it quite early on, like Japan, where these dynamics are less favorable, where people feel the government kind of dropped the ball, that the government has been a little bit haphazard, not very clear, not systematic, not consistent in its response. People don't really trust it. People stay at home, and you see mobility and the impact on the economy worsening. So I would say if you look at the Asian experience more broadly, I would say the one lesson that we draw from this, the only economies where you do see that the economic impact is starting to turn around and where we see an economic recovery are those where the government really was on the ball and has been able to decisively contain the COVID-19 outbreak. And when I say contain the outbreak, I'm looking at a pattern for the number of new daily cases, where the new daily cases have fallen very, very sharply from the peak, and where that peak is a long time ago. And unfortunately, if I look at Europe and the US from that perspective, I have to conclude, and this is that's why I said it's a bit of a hard lesson. I think that in Europe, many countries are not really ready for this opening up, if I look at it from an Asian perspective. But I'm happy to put this as a point for discussion with my panel members.
Well, it's fascinating, and we've got so many questions coming in now. So thank you to everybody out there for submitting these questions. And Louis, it's quite early in the session, but I'm gonna try and give you one of the most tricky questions that's come in. That's okay. And
Sure.
and if you sort of bring all these constituent parts together and look at the sort of macro trajectory of things, one question we've got here is: do you expect any change to the pace and nature of globalization and global partnerships following this crisis?
Yes, this is a very good question. We get it a lot, unfortunately, and the answer is a little sobering. It's hard to envisage the globalization process remaining unscathed after all this, right? We have a lot of soul searching, a lot of criticism. There's a huge amount of, blame gaming between, especially the G2, the China and the US, and so I think that we are already seeing that a lot of companies have now even more reasons to look at their supply chain and see how they can make changes. Working in Asia, I would say, we again, just as we saw with the trade war, and even before that, the wage increases in China, because this is yet another reason why many companies are considering to make changes to their supply chain, and some are doing it, many others are not, because it is actually not that straightforward. So for us, it's always an interesting question to see how many actually do end up making those changes, especially in those very big categories like electronics and other very large economic industries, as opposed to just say sneaker production, where you have seen already a very big outflow and big changes in these supply chains. But I would say overall, yes, I mean, it's undoubtedly for anything that has a national security or even a medical dimension, many countries, even smaller ones, are going to be adamant that they have their own supply chain. And I think this is unfortunately also going to then occur in many other industries that are deemed strategic for one reason or the other.
Well, I mean, it sounds very much like your views, the whole economic ecosystem is going to be functioning quite differently for some time. And can I just turn to Klaus now and just ask more about some of the big actors in that ecosystem? Klaus, can I ask you, how do you assess the progress that central banks and national governments, how do you assess the progress that's been made in blunting the impact of the global pandemic, whilst also keeping markets functioning?
Right. I mean, I think that central banks and governments are throwing the proverbial kitchen sink at this. I think we've stopped counting, but I think that 20 to 25% in terms of global GDP is now probably being mobilized to combat this, and this does not include the ostensible unlimited stimulus programs that central bank use, because central bank stimulus is different. What you get from central bank is pledges to do unlimited support, and then these programs kind of just roll on. And that's been very effective in cushioning financial markets. But as we're now learning is that, there's a very big difference in economics, and it's almost like a baseline fundamental difference between the creation of nominal money, liquidity that can hold up financial assets. But in the real economy, when things just stop, it's obviously very difficult to, over time, to prevent jobs from being lost, bankruptcies. But I think, we should give governments and central banks the credit for reacting very aggressively, very quickly. But the reality, as I see it, is simply that, obviously it's going to cost a lot of money, which is, one part of it, but it is very difficult. It is very difficult to just assume you can send a check to everyone, either be that a company or a household, and so they can pay their bills, and then just assume that we can restart at some point at a later stage. I think that chicken is going to come home to roost, and I think there's going to be political consequences here, because and we see this in the U.S. in particular, because the U.S. is kind of like the epicenter of this, but it's reflected elsewhere, namely this idea that it's pretty easy to print your way out of a Wall Street crisis. You can save Wall Street, but saving Main Street is much more difficult when you have a government that mandates that activity has to stop. So that's a challenge, political challenge as well.
I mean, it's fascinating. So, I mean, obviously, there's a huge amount of activity going on. As I've mentioned before, there are some similarities across certainly a lot of the European countries and similarities with the UK in terms of the tools and strategies that they're developing. What's your assessment? What's your view about, have you been surprised by the range of tools and interventions that have been deployed? Have you been disappointed perhaps at the lack of variety and innovation that's been applied?
Well, I think, for example, in the European context, I think that I give credit to policymakers for realizing early that this was going to hit the small and medium-sized business sector very hard. And so we've seen loan guarantee programs, we've seen job retention schemes as well. And they more or less broadly, I would say, they seem to have been working okay. For example, just to take one very specific example, in Eurozone, we can see that lending, actually bank lending to companies are going up. which is very paradoxical given that economic activity is collapsing. So what's happening is that some companies want liquidity, and the banking system is kind of responding to them in order to prevent liquidity from drying up. But going back to Rain's point, obviously what's happening here is that these companies then end up taking on a lot of debt, which they might not have wanted to do, but they kind of feel that they have to. And again, that's absolutely necessary. So I would say that the broad spectrum and palette of responses across Europe has been job retention scheme or a boost to unemployment insurance, loan guarantee programs to small and medium-sized businesses, and then you've had on the central bank side, you've had pump priming. I mean, basically, nothing. There's no taboos here when it comes to central bank policies, and I think, the only thing they're not buying is stocks. But if we had another big drawdown in stocks, I think they would buy that as well, especially if the lockdowns remained in place. So yeah, but it's difficult to make sure the money goes where it's supposed to go. That's the problem. That is not easy. It's just not easy.
And if I could sort of mischievously give you another sort of crystal ball type question too, once these interventions have been in place and they've worked for some time, we then get to the difficult set of policy decisions about withdrawing some of those measures. And I wonder what challenges you foresee when we get to that point.
They'll be brutal. It'll be absolutely brutal, and it'll be politically viciously difficult. Just think about finance ministers. It's in some sense it's easy for a finance minister to come out. Especially in the UK, we've seen the example, come out and you promise the world and say, look, we're gonna protect your jobs. We're gonna pay you whatever 80% of your salary. But at some point, you have to take that back. And if you're still in an environment where consumers might not be super eager to travel or to go out, or your business will be in trouble, and you have to withdraw, very difficult. And it's going to be very difficult to strike that balance. And I think, and by the way, just to then, to answer your question directly, yes, they will absolutely have to do that, because what we're doing now is extraordinary in terms of support. And even if we assume we can just print the money, which I know that is kind of like an underlying assumption, you can't do that forever. So that is going to be a political challenge everywhere.
Thank you. And obviously you mentioned the political challenge everywhere, and an area that is certainly not immune from political challenges is Saudi Arabia, the Middle East. And so, Monica, can I just turn to you now? And we've had some breaking news this morning that Saudi Arabia is introducing austerity measures. Can I just firstly start by asking for your view on what we've heard this morning?
Well, as with the other regions, the impact of COVID-19, the fall in oil price on the Gulf region will be very, very painful and difficult. As a region, we are very externally facing. Of course, there's oil and petrochemicals, and we've seen the sharp fall in that. For most of the GCC countries, oil revenue still accounts for the largest share of government revenues. But even if we look at diversification and where the diversification has happened, it's very externally facing sectors. So the UAE is the best example, and we look at it, it's trade, logistics, tourism, airlines, hospitality. So we believe that the impact on growth in our region is going to be very, very substantial this year. And we expect a contraction both in oil and non-oil GDP growth. The impact on the fiscal position, of course, is then going to be devastating as well. And we expect to see a marked deterioration as government revenues fall. The initial response of the GCC countries was the support measures, as we've seen globally, with a greater focus, I believe, in our region on monetary rather than fiscal. And we've seen some positive impact of that. Liquidity in the banking sector remains ample. We haven't seen interbank rates rise markedly. In fact, they've come down since end February levels. We've seen the differential between US interbank rates and regional interbank rates. The margin has remained relatively narrow as well, unlike in 2008 and 2009. But however, I'd just like to highlight within the Gulf, there's marked differences in the fiscal strength. That goes to the size of the fiscal deficit expected, the reserves and the debt position, and the weaker fiscally positioned countries, notably Bahrain, Oman and Saudi Arabia, have had to introduce austerity measures. And as you mentioned this morning, Guy, Saudi Arabia announced an increase in VAT from 5 to 15%, some pullback in allowances for public sector workers, and also pullback in project expenditure. We still expect to see a large fiscal deficit of around 16% of GDP in Saudi Arabia. A lot of the pullback in spending was to support higher spending required for the health sector and to support businesses as well. So a lot of this is to do with redistribution of spending. And we think it's going to be a long road for fiscal adjustment over the next few years.
Can I just, we're going to go to questions at the end of the session, but one of the questions that's getting the most number of likes that's coming through on our system here is all about oil prices. So I'm going to just try and put that to you. The question is, you know, with the news coming out of the Middle East, you know, oil prices, you know, that have gone negative, is increasing taxes going to be the global standard way forward in the post-COVID-19 world?
Sorry, is that for me? Is that for me?
Yes, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think in the region and globally, you are going to see fiscal deficits widen significantly as a result of these measures, as a result of lower economic activity. So tax revenues are going to come down substantially. So I think once we do get to the other side of this COVID-19 crisis pandemic, I think focus across the globe will really be on rebalancing the fiscal positions as well. But I think even ahead of the global crisis, I think there'll also be a lot of impact of redistribution of wealth as well. We've seen income inequality increase over the last few decades, but particularly since the global crisis as well. And I think a lot of the economic and political challenges that we've seen across the globe over the last few years have really reflected that. So I think this balance between readjustment, reducing deficits, but also redistribution of income, wealth, and equality in society is going to be a very critical question going forward. For the Gulf region, we had made relatively limited fiscal reforms from the oil price collapse in 2014, 2015. In fact, as oil prices increased in 17 and 18, we saw these measures reduced. But now going forward, you know, we have to see greater, deeper fiscal adjustment in the region, and that will remain critical to improve the medium and longer term health of the region.
One of the most interesting things to observe is how the Gulf region partners and deals with the rest of the world. Do you expect that to change and develop differently as we emerge out of this crisis?
I think we have been seeing changes in relationships anyway over the last few years. Greater links have developed between Asia, including China and India. These are going to be very important source markets for energy demand going forward, not only LNG and crude, but also refined products. We're seeing stronger relationships between the Gulf and Asia. I think also what's going to be an interesting development to see how that balances, how if there's any sort of worsening in relations between, say, China and US, the role that the GCC will play. But I think what they've done is they've tried to stay out of geopolitical developments across the globe, rather trying to make sure that they are sort of an energy provider and try to remain neutral in that game.
Excellent, thank you. I think now would be a really good time to take a look at some of the questions that have been coming in, and thanks to all of you out there for taking the time to submit the questions. Some of the questions have been mentioned have been covered already. Some very popular ones are coming through. One of the questions that seems to be coming through again and again, phrased in different ways, is about consumer confidence. And the question really, I think, is for all panelists here, which is, what are your expectations as to when and how consumer confidence might get back to pre-COVID levels? So can I start by putting that to you, Monica, as you're here, and then I'll ask the other panelists to contribute a point of view.
I think it's very, very difficult to put an exact timeline, because we actually don't know when we're going to fully emerge from this global crisis. And I think the longer it lasts, the greater the impact is going to be on unemployment. I don't think governments can continue indefinitely, if unemployment continues to rise, to provide the same degree of support.
I don't think there's anyone whose lives hasn't been changed by this crisis. I think the bigger unknown is how our attitudes towards flying over the long term. How will our attitudes around the environment? And I think businesses are asking a lot more questions now about the role both of the sort of transition to a low carbon economy. Where does that sort of fit in the rebuilding of the economies as we come out of this? And I think, as Monica was saying as well, it's also around inequality, because actually this crisis is hitting households very differently. If you're on lower incomes, you're much more likely to be working in a sector, in retail or in other sectors, leisure and hospitality, the sectors that have been really hit by the necessary closures, and therefore your household incomes and your risk of being unemployed are much higher. Whereas, many people in professional services have been able to move from working from home quite seamlessly. So I think this is the other challenge, is it's hitting households very unequally. And so therefore that means what's the right policy at any one time is different. And I think how we maintain the social contract and make sure that we're helping vulnerable households through this crisis becomes even more important.
Thank you. And so sector differences, household differences. Klaus, can I just ask you about the differences between nations in the Eurozone? What are you noticing? What are you expecting in terms of consumer confidence as our recovery pans out?
Yeah, so in the euro area, consumer confidence has been hit relatively hard in France and Southern Europe, because that's where the lockdowns has been hard, has been most restrictive. It's also incidentally where the services sectors are the major and most important parts of the economies compared to elsewhere. So it would make sense that consumer sentiment has been hit hardest there. I think that obviously, first of all, I would say that I do think to echo what my fellow panelists have already said, I do think that there are going to be sort of semi-permanent changes into consumer behavior here, and to identify them is obviously going to be very difficult. But one thing I'd say, I think flying, for example, is going to be more expensive, and less people will do it over for quite a long time. Simply, I think because capacity is now being destroyed in the airline sector. And that means, and we might not be able to be as many people in the airplane as we were before, things like that. So it's going to be more expensive. So I think there's going to be a feedback loop. Also, you asked Louis earlier whether globalization is kind of taking a knock here. I most definitely think it will take a knock. That means higher prices for services and goods that are, and I just think that is going to be a lasting impact. I would say that I am optimistic, going back to the point that Rain just said, that when we can see our families and our friends again, and when some of these things kinds of sort of the normal ways in which we act in the economy, when we're able to do that, I actually think some of the consumer sentiment indicators are going to pick back up. I would say Q4 even, I would expect some of these numbers to come back up, but I think there's going to be some underlying shifts here in consumer patterns which are going to be longer lasting. And yes, income inequality and wealth inequality is going to be exacerbated by this, because some people are going to get through this better than others. And like I said in my earlier response, the policy response is aimed at trying to make that difference less, right? To make sure, but it's very difficult to, I mean, it's a cold and brutal world, and if you have a strong balance sheet, and if you have a little bit more savings than the rest, I mean, you will get through this easier than those who don't. I mean, that is just the reality of it, right? So yeah.
The harsh reality. And Louis, you and I have spoken before about the differences that you've seen from where you're sitting in Hong Kong. How's that playing out in terms of consumer confidence? What's your view about across the region that you're working in, how that might play out?
Yeah, Guy. So I think I agree with a lot of what my panel colleagues have mentioned about differences between sectors, about some of the headwinds, with this going to be, a very long, drawn-out problem for sectors like aerospace. I also, though, want to emphasize, please let's not forget what I see in China, Hong Kong, other Asian countries. It's not just the economic concerns that prevent people from going out and consuming. It's very much also the medical concerns. So what we see is that in those countries where the government was trying to kind of cut corners and open up the economy, or not take the kind of measures that its own population was expecting. This is, for instance, what we saw in Japan. It's backfiring because people stay at home and don't want to go out. Whereas in those economies where you do see that in the eyes of the public, this whole medical thing is contained, we can start to, breathe a little bit. Like I live in Hong Kong, we very much feel that over here. We have not had a locally transmitted case now in something like 20 days. We have a few cases every second day or so, but they tend to be from people coming in from abroad. They are quarantined, they are tested. It's pretty much under control. And we see that. I also, want to emphasize that. And I think this is something that Klaus mentioned before, that we also shouldn't be surprised if and when people feel it's okay again, that innate desire to go out and walk in a park, eat ice cream, go to a movie, do all these kind of things is pretty strong. And we saw here over the weekend, our shopping areas were full of people going all out. So I think we also shouldn't underestimate the rebound, to the extent that people can afford it. And here I think my colleagues' points are well taken. And I guess governments that have used all their gunpowder to carry people over that bridge may have used too much gunpowder, in the sense that it's quite important for governments to be able to flank this recovery once the economy is up and running again. I see that in China, for instance, where we now get quite good, quite positive vibes coming from sectors like the car market, where you have some subsidies and where governments are quite keen, to see this, local governments quite keen to see this recovering again. We now hear that the car market is rebounding quite strongly. That is, of course, in part because people don't like flying so much, and they don't like the public transport so much, so they prefer to travel to work in their own car. So that goes back to those sectoral decisions. But I also think if and when you can, as a government, give people the confidence, and if you have a little bit of fiscal room to actually support that, because in China they also spend money now on subsidizing meals and other forms of consumption, then you can actually go a long way in helping that consumption rebound.
It's fascinating because what you've just touched on also, I think, clearly has struck a nerve with the audience, because now our most popular question is that simple but difficult question to answer, which is that response to the virus in all countries really is a balance between health and economics. And I think what people want to know, and it's certainly what the press want to know, is are we getting that balance right? Can I put that to you first of all, and then we'll ask some of our other panelists.
Yeah, sure. But I'm looking forward to the response of my European panel colleague, because I have to admit, as I said, from an Asian perspective, I think the trajectory in Europe and the US is looking a little challenging, in the sense that in Asia, the only governments that have successfully opened up the economy again are those where we have seen a very significant decline in the number of new daily cases. So where the public feels this is a credible strategy and we're okay with going out. And so I'm not an expert at all on Europe and the US, but just looking at the numbers of new daily cases, I wonder if that is not a little premature. I wonder in Europe and the US if the expectations of the public, the understandable expectations that we need to get the economy running again, I'm not sure if enough has been done on the containment front to actually deliver on that.
Klaus, would you like to respond to that? Yeah. Obviously, you've got the Eurozone remit. How would you go about answering this question, this balance between health and economics?
Obviously, it's very difficult, and I would say the only thing I would say now is that it's a political question, right? And I think in order to answer it from the point of view of the people that are listening to this, I think we now have to apply a certain sense of cynicism to this question, namely that there is a politically acceptable rate of infection and rate of deaths, and that number is non-zero. And now governments in the Eurozone are trying to find that, and they're doing so more or less in the same way by opening very slowly, not too dissimilar to what we're seeing in the UK, trying to open very slowly, making sure that and now, I mean, I'd say that, yesterday the UK, where Rain can speak most of that, but yesterday the UK had this, with different levels of alerts, and it's not as explicit in the Eurozone, but it's the same idea. But no, I think personally, that if we can keep the number of new cases, for example, just to take like a very sort of a specific one, if we can keep the daily increase to an increment there between 0 and 0.5%, something like that, so that the curve is flattening. If the health system is not breaking down like we saw early in Italy, I think governments are going to continue to reopen. And that then brings the question back to, in terms of what is the right balance. It's very difficult to say, but I think that we have to apply a certain sense of cruel cynicism in order to understand it. And the final point I'd mention is I agree with Louis, though, in terms of behavior matters as well. If people are scared to go out, it won't work. And we don't know that yet. We'll have to see how it plays out, right?
Rain, can I put that to you? There's some of this very difficult thinking that Klaus just mentioned, whether the cruel cynicism, the trying to figure out what the acceptable levels of infection are. Do you see that playing out in the UK also?
Well, I don't think it's just a sort of straight trade-off between health on the one hand and the economy on the other. And I think that's sort of come across from what other panelists have been saying, because I think I really build on what Louis was saying. I think what everyone wants is us to be making the right judgments informed by science, but also just being conscious that, if you just try to minimize the number of deaths from the coronavirus, there are other issues and very real other health concerns that will emerge over time. It is just not feasible or right for everyone to stay in their homes for a period of 2 years. So I think it's really about, and what the UK is very gently trying to look at is how can we start to reopen more of our sectors? How can we change some of the advice? And this is the challenging issue for government, is if you start with a very simple message, stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives, that is the simplest of messages and everyone can understand it. But once you start to need to move away from it, it needs to become more nuanced, and you have to rely as well on people and businesses making sensible judgments. And I think, look, employers as well, they don't want to open up if their staff don't feel comfortable coming to work and feel safe at their place of work. So there's no point sort of opening up the economy if you don't have that confidence. And I think that's why, these issues around tracking and testing is so important, and certainly where countries need to build their capacity, and I think that's particularly some of the European countries have found it more difficult to build that capacity as quickly as they would like, but that is undoubtedly one of the core elements in making people feel safe and have confidence. Because I think the challenge is if you open up too quickly and the rate of infection increases too fast, and then you have to do a drastic lockdown again. I don't think anyone wants to see that. So, but I think it's about opening up gradually, and then where there are issues, you may have to change tack, you may have to change the advice, but I think it's about having evolution. And I come back to what Louis was saying. It's clear, consistent messaging that's joined up with what employers are saying, what some of the trade unions are saying, and that sort of joined up piece between the scientists, business and the wider community. It really has to be a joint effort, because if any one of those pieces, moves ahead too far without the others on side, the social contract is undermined, and I don't think that's what anyone wants.
Well, another potentially challenging and potentially oversimplified trade-off is the trade-off between economic progress and sort of trading our way out of this and the environment. And that's something that has come up a lot in questions from the audience. It's certainly a question that in the media people are asking a lot about. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because I guess there are different ways this could play out. People are talking about, isn't it great the planet's getting a break? Then equally, activists, I think, are worried that we could get into a situation where green initiatives are deprioritized. How do you see that trade-off?
So I think it's absolutely at the forefront of people's minds. And I think here in the UK, I mean, just about a year ago this time, we had the UK government adopting a net zero target by 2050. And I think that's still very much where the business community is at. And as we start to reopen our economy, it's very much on that trajectory. And I think, look, globally, obviously one of the positives of this crisis, I don't think anyone would have wanted this kind of brutal adjustment, is greenhouse gas emissions are likely to fall by around 8% this year. That's probably what we need to be on to tackle climate change. But I think what we want to see from now is a more is a slow transition where we're prioritizing investment in renewable energy, and where we do need to think about, take the idea that in the next phase, we might need to see more government spending around infrastructure projects. Those were in the pipeline already. Where are you going to prioritize, given where the crisis is at the moment in the UK? Absolutely around digital and broadband infrastructure, because more and more people are working from home. Another way is thinking about how we promote, how we heat our homes, how we build our homes to be carbon neutral. And actually, there's probably a lot we could do to bring forward some of the investment we were planning to do as a nation earlier and make those a priority. And thinking about car manufacturers, what they want to do is to continue investing in low emission and electric vehicles, and having the right incentives for consumers as we come out of this to buy those vehicles, rather than just sort of direct support for a company or sector without thinking about those broader objectives. So my sense is it absolutely is on the forefront of everyone's mind. I think being able to breathe clean air in our cities has brought that home to people. And I think it's also shown us that when we are faced with a really big challenge, we can think more innovatively about policy. We can work together to come up with solutions to try and make that transition. I think we just want to make sure it's a transition rather than a brutal stop. I think that's what everyone wants to see.
And Louis, I'd be interested to get your views on this. I mean, do you see this trade-off being a problematic one? Is it something that you've been concerned about, this ability for us to get back to economic growth, economic success, but at the same time ensuring that environmental initiatives don't get sort of put by the wayside?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I have two comments on this, and they may not necessarily point in the same direction. I personally think, because I get a lot of questions, and I have discussions as well about people making the point that isn't this a good chance also to for instance, introduce a basic income, or to carry out other major institutional or structural reforms. Part of me says, I'm not sure, because shouldn't we put most of our effort now in basically fighting a fire that is burning, and we need to make sure that that we can choke the fire rather than say rebuild the house already. And so that there is a part of me that is a little bit conservative or cautious as to how much we can do. But then I also completely agree with Rain that there's a lot that governments and business can do to think about, for instance, if we are going to institute a fiscal spending package, let's do this wisely, and let's not support sectors that we don't think belong in the economy 5 years down the road. And so let's put our eggs, where we think that this is sustainable and constructive and towards our future economy. So I think there is a lot of room for smart policy making, but I also wouldn't want to complicate us. I wouldn't want to complicate our route to recovery by taking this as the occasion to kind of solve all our economic problems.
I mean, that's a really interesting point. We live in a time, don't we, where there is a lot of pragmatic problem solving going on, but equally there are some strong ideologies all around the world, both on what you might call the left and the right of politics. Do you think there's a danger that we might see some opportunism here, that people, groups, governments even might see this as an opportunity to put in place things that support their ideology that may not be entirely healthy for the business community or the economy?
I personally don't think it's just a danger. It's already happening, so it's not a risk. This is part of our baseline, and I think it's normal. We should expect that, people have the right to do that. But I would personally say, as a hard-nosed policymaker, if you're a minister of finance or a prime minister, you should listen to all the interests and groups, but you should not forget what is the most important thing of the day. And at the moment, that is just to carry our economies over on a growth trajectory.
Okay. Well, Monica, can I just finally turn to you to give the perspective from the Gulf region? I mean, how does the difficult trade-off between recovery from the COVID crisis and preservation, development of environmental initiatives, how is that playing out in the Gulf region at the moment?
Well, that's always been very much in the mind of policymakers when we do talk about fiscal adjustment, because yes, this crisis has brought forward this debate of the environment, and I think the focus was already there, but it's brought it to the forefront. But we were always working with an assumption over the last few years. We've moved from concerns of peak supply concerns to peak demand, and as we move towards electric cars, new forms of renewable energy, a more green economy, of course that's going to reduce demand for hydrocarbons as we look to reduce single-use plastic for petrochemical production. So I think what it really does is enforce the will to diversify the economy, or enforce the vast need to increase diversification. But there's a big issue as well, because in the Gulf countries, the most of the demand in the non-oil economy, apart from the UAE, as we mentioned, was already more diversified, comes from government getting oil revenues and spending it in the non-oil economy, and that being multiplied. We're now in a very difficult position that oil prices are low. We have to pull back government spending and introduce austerity measures. At the same time, it's difficult to have a meaningful austerity program where most of your demand comes from government spending. And where do you get the funds to diversify your economy? And which areas do you diversify your economy in? We're not going to go in traditional industries that may be in the 50s and 60s, the hardcore industrial manufacturing industry. So I think it raises a lot of longer term questions for the Gulf, that how do we move forward when so much of the economy, not just government demand, government revenue, comes from hydrocarbons. So it's a critical issue for us. And at the moment, it's very difficult to see that diversification, because again, most of the diversification was in areas such as tourism, trade, etc. But airlines are going to, as we've all discussed before, that's going to be one of the sectors that's going to be hardest hit, hardest to recover from. And also in a world of, as Louis mentioned, potentially deglobalization. You know, Dubai is a trading hub for the catchment areas increasing east to west, but you know, where do we fit in? So it's a lot of difficult questions that at this point there's very limited answers, and we have to keep working on that.
Well, thank you. Just one of many difficult questions that I know will be continue to be debated by both our panelists and the audience listening in too. And we've got just 1 minute left, so I'd just like firstly to thank Louis, Monica, Rain, and Klaus for some fantastic contributions. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks to all of you out there who are listening. Thanks also for submitting your fantastic questions. The debate continues, of course. This is part of International Treasury Week. Loads more content and events to watch out for on the ACT website. Please do continue to submit your points of view and your questions, your discussion points through the discussion boards. Also, please do watch out for at ACT Update, that profile on Twitter, the ACT LinkedIn pages too, using, if you like, the hashtag ACTITW. We really appreciate all of the great points you've had to make, and we look forward to a really exciting week ahead. Thanks again.
Thank you.